much. Well, this story began for me, we could have a slide, just over 20 years ago when I was in Budapest and I was waiting for a train. And I'd been there for a couple of months trying to write a really awful novel. Well, actually, I was trying to write a good novel, but it didn't turn out that way. And I'd been in a rather sort of cut off, working very hard, very strange state of mind, and getting on this train journey, which was going to take about 15 hours or something back to London. And I realised I didn't have anything to read. And what I really fancied was one of those completely just fun, reassuring, completely gripping airport kind of novels, you know, the sort that are very thick and with a one-word title, something like Lust or Power or Thrill. And there was a second-hand bookshop just opposite the station. So I went in there looking for something like this, and then realised that all the books in there were in Hungarian, which is only reasonable for Budapest. But there was one shelf of foreign language books. So I had a look at that and realised that they were pretty much all in German. But there was one book in English, and so that seemed the natural choice. And the good news was that it did have a one-word title, Essays by Michel de Montaigne, who I'd only vaguely heard of. I mean, I'd heard of him as I knew he was kind of Renaissance, 16th century, writing about how to sort of live well. I thought he probably would be rather pontificating and rather dull, but it's all there was. So I bought it, got on the train, spent about the first 5 hours just looking out the window, as you do on trains, and eventually it got dark outside, so I started reading. And was completely astonished to find not at all what I'd expected. He was 16th century, but that's about where it ended, because he was chatting away about himself, he was friendly, approachable, he was entertaining. It was just like having someone very entertaining sitting on the seat opposite mine and talking to me about his life. He wrote about his family, he wrote about his childhood, his work, he wrote about people that he'd met, books that he'd read, favourite bits from his reading. He talked about things like lamenting his terrible memory, and this was something that this is the first thing I remember reading in Montaigne that absolutely grabbed me, because I could relate to that straight away. He said that memory is a very fine and useful faculty. I find absolutely no trace of it in myself. And I could really relate to that. I had the same problem and still do. And he said actually that when he was out riding or walking, and if he had a particularly good idea that he wanted to write about, he'd have to tell somebody else so that that other person could tell him when he got back to his pen and paper and was able to write it down. He wrote about things like being moody, being suffering from odd things like vanity and knowing that he was being vain, but just he couldn't help it. And he wrote about the fact that if it was a beautiful sunny day, he would be a really pleasant, easygoing fellow, but if he had a corn on his toe that was bothering him, he'd become foul-tempered and surly. So just complete flux of self from one moment to the next. And he wrote about his cat and his dog. His cat, we have the next. There's a nice little picture of that. I immediately related to that because I'd been separated from my cat for all those months in Budapest, and I missed him. And he wrote about how he would play with his cat and wonder while he was doing it whether she was amusing herself with him just as much as he was with her. So he had this always questioning, asking questions and looking at things from different points of view. He wrote about all sorts of other things. He wrote about idleness. He wrote about sex quite a bit. He kind of too much information, actually, sometimes. He wrote about his sort of thumbs. He wrote about things that he was interested in. He wrote about his passions and his lack of passion sometimes. He wrote about things like how his tastes had changed over the years, so that he once liked radishes. This, I remember, was one of the first things that caught my eye. He liked radishes, then he went off them, then he went back to liking them again. He used to like red wine, then he liked white wine, then he went back to liking red wine again. And I could actually relate to that because of course, I've always had things like that. When I was in Hungary, I'd always hated ice cream. One of my first summer jobs was selling ice creams on the beach, and it was the first perfect job for me because I wasn't at all tempted to eat them. But while in Hungary, I discovered that I did like ice cream after all. I later found out that it was only Hungarian ice cream that I liked, but I eventually built on that, and now I like all ice cream, which is quite an achievement. So, yeah, all these things that absolutely beguiled me, and all these things where I recognized myself, and I thought, this is just like meeting a different version of me. I became quite curious to find out more about him, and when I got back home, I found out a little bit about his life. There he is. I found out that he was born in 1533. He lived in the chateau that he inherited from his family, a very nice one. The next. It was a wine-growing chateau, and he had a very unusual upbringing. His father, who had all these strange ideals and sort of thoughts about what you could do with a child, decided to bring him up. Well, one thing was that he wanted him to be a native speaker of Latin, so he refused to let anybody talk to him in French. Even his own mother, the servants, they all had to learn Latin if they wanted to talk to the boy. It was a very strange experiment. But he also believed that a child should learn out of curiosity and interest and pleasure rather than because they're forced to sit down in a schoolroom and study. So he let the boy just pursue whatever he wanted to learn about. And he also thought that it was very bad for children to be woken up with a start in the morning. So he had a lute player sit by his bedside to gently strum him awake with his lute. And this was another thing that I could really relate to. My parents didn't actually bring me up as a native Latin speaker, and they didn't hire a lute player, which is something that I've taken them to task about ever since. But they did teach me they didn't really teach me anything. They let me explore what I wanted to learn at my own pace, following my own curiosity, and taking me travelling, and I felt something in common with him there. So he did go to school and get a proper job. He was a magistrate in Bordeaux for 13 years. Then he gave it up quite suddenly and retired back to his chateau to look after the wine business, which is still running today, although it's not in the family anymore, and to reflect. And this is, after a couple of years, he started writing his essays, which is a word that he coined. It just means attempt or tries, having a go. And he carried on sort of jotting these down for some years, eventually published the first edition of those in 1580, and he continued adding to it, so more editions came out, and he ended up adding material to it for about 20 years. He didn't entirely just withdraw from the world, because he did also go travelling, and he was also mayor of Bordeaux, so he went back into public life. His travels, he went for a year and a half's trip around Italy and Switzerland, and had a whale of a time because, again, this constant curiosity. So he met the Pope, he met prostitutes, he met people of all denominations, he went to synagogues, he went to Protestant churches. He always quizzed everybody that he met about their way of life. And he died in 1592, but he left behind this wonderful work, the essays, which immediately became my bedside reading and carried on being so from then till now. But what started to strike me was, from this initial familiarity of everything seeming like something that I could be me, or that, it was amazing, 400 years and yet we're all still the same, I started to notice things that didn't really fit, things that were awkward or kind of stuck in my throat, or things that I couldn't make sense of. And one of these is, with his life, is, bringing a boy up speaking Latin. What on earth? This is hard for us to understand these days. It's something we can't easily imagine doing. And there were other things that he wrote about that were just hard to make head or tail of. And I became very interested in finding out more about the things that didn't fit as well as the things that did fit. And I also started reading what people had made of him over the years. And of course, most people reported this same experience of, he's just like me. But the funny thing is that they were recognizing things that were actually completely different from me. And each era was making it their own Montaigne. And that became part of the story for me as well. You can see a little bit in pictures of him. That was done in his lifetime. That's probably the most authentic portrait we have. The next one is done in the following century, and he's starting to get a bit sort of, a bit more of an attitude. The next one, he's getting very coy indeed. And actually a friend of mine thought that, looking at that, thought that he was actually not wearing anything except the ruff. And suddenly I can see it. He looks naked apart from a sash and a ruff. The next one, this is the Romantic era, when they wanted to make him look like he'd either just come down off a mountaintop, sweeping down with all this genius in his mind, or that he'd just been for a visit to the Bee Gees hairdresser, but giving him these flowing locks and sense of drama about him, which was quite alien really to him himself. And the next one is the proper Victorian gentleman. This is a very 19th century Montaigne. The next one is another... He's naked again, and this time he's being cast in the role of an ancient sage or an ancient wise man, philosopher, a real philosopher. And that one is a 20th century interpretation. 20th century was very fascinated by his interest in cannibals and cultural relativism, which is something that hadn't particularly struck earlier generations. And this is the result. The final image, that's actually, to me, that sums it up more than anything, because this is a statue of him outside the Sorbonne in Paris, and students are about to go into an exam, touch his toe for luck. And you can see there, if your image is good enough, you can see where it's been worn down by, actually not many, because that's a copy, so it's only since the 60s that they've been, this version has been stroked by students. So that, to me, it sort of captures both sides of that, because I think there's the fact that we all want something from Montaigne. We all want to take something for ourselves out of him and to put him to our own purposes, as we do with all writers from the past, but especially somebody like him, where you can find so much in him. But we also leave our mark on him, so we change him as we do that. We make a new version of him, and this kind of captures that mixture, which is really what I wanted to get a sense of. I wanted to get this feeling of how we sort of create our own Montaigne, and to really, my own sort of story has been of recognizing him, saying he's just like me, then finding how incredibly strange he was, and I think that's what always happens with writers of the past. And then kind of rediscovering a familiarity again, because in the end it's always going to be mine. And I think that's probably, am I just about, I've got 2 minutes and I've sort of come to the end of it. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just tell you a bit more about his travels, because I think that's one of the things that first attracted me to him. He actually wrote only odds and ends about that in the essays, but he kept a journal of his travels. And it's really there more than anywhere else. People, especially in the 18th century, it was discovered in, his travel journal was discovered in an old his castle, his chateau, the tower where he had his library was being used as a potato store and a chicken coop and things like that in those days. But in one of the great potato sort of vats, somebody found this old manuscript, which was his journal of his travels in Italy. And it's really incredible, because it gives you such a sense of his enthusiasm for finding out new things and for discovering things that actually contradicted his expectations. So hence his eagerness to discover different forms of religious service that were not the same as his own Catholic upbringing. But he picked up stories wherever he went. There was one village where he went to, and he found a man whose hair had gone white on one side and was dark on the other, and that was because he had lost his brother, and in grieving he held his head in his hands for so long that all his hair went completely white on that side. In another village, he met some girls who had dressed and lived as men and actually married other women. And there was another village near there where there was a story about a man who had been born as a girl, but one day when he was leaping over an obstacle, a set of what he called virile instruments popped out as he was leaping over this thing. And so from then on, he lived as a man. And there was a folk song in the village that warned girls not to jump too high in case the same thing happened to them. And then he went on. Every page is full of things like that. And I think that was quite interesting to me too, because he was always engaged in the world, as was I, but he also had this liking for withdrawing himself from the world and reflecting on his experience. When he first went to this tower to start writing the essays, he wrote an inscription on the wall saying, I've decided to withdraw to the realm of the muses to spend what little time I have left in thoughtful reflection before my time runs out. He was 37 at the time, and he actually would have expected to live a lot longer because his father and grandfather before him had lived to be about 90. But I think it was just an excuse, really. I think that's what he wanted, was just to step out of the world, which is very much what I did in my period of time in Hungary, so perhaps that's why it struck such a chord. And I think I'll leave it there. I think that just about is my 2 minutes. Thanks very much.